September 2026. The East China Sea. USS Michael Monsoor, hull number DDG-1001, loitering 180 nautical miles east of the Senkaku Islands for 7 consecutive days. Not transiting, not responding to a crisis, loitering. And every single morning, a PLAN Y9JB electronic intelligence aircraft flew out from the mainland to look at her, every morning for a week. What Monsoor was showing them was the part that does not appear in any official statement. A directed energy mount, derived from the Navy's HELIOS program, rotating in daylight, activated in what the service would call unclassified test mode, a laser turret, spinning slowly, in full view of Chinese sensors. The question is not what Monsoor could shoot. The question is why the Pentagon chose this hull, this week, this position, with a weapon system that was not yet operational in any combat sense. And why Beijing's electronic intelligence aircraft came out every single day, as if ordered to make sure they had the geometry right. The ship was not there to fight. She was there to be seen. And the audience was not the Japanese Coast Guard, and it was not Taiwan, and it was not even the PLAN surface fleet that would eventually read the signals reports. The audience was a room of wargaming analysts in Beijing, who were, at that exact moment, running final numbers on what it would cost to saturate a 7th Fleet task group with anti-ship cruise missiles and cheap drone swarms 3 months from now, when the Fujian carrier group was scheduled to conduct its first blue water certification south of Okinawa. To understand what Monsoor was actually doing 180 miles east of the Senkakus, you have to understand the specific math problem she was sent to disrupt. And to understand that math problem, you have to go back to the geometry of the first island chain, the design logic of the Zumwalt class, and a procurement decision the Navy made in 2021 that most analysts dismissed as a budget line item. That decision is the reason this deployment happened, and the Fujian certification schedule is why it happened in September. If you want the strategy behind the headline, instead of the headline, subscribe to Blue Water. This is what the channel is for. The first island chain runs from the Japanese home islands south through the Ryukyus, past Taiwan, through the Philippines, and down to Borneo. It is a geographic fact that predates any alliance structure, and its strategic logic is simple. Any Chinese naval force that wants to operate in the open Pacific must transit one of a limited number of gaps. The Miyako Strait, between Miyako Island and Okinawa, is 170 nautical miles wide. The Luzon Strait, between Taiwan and the Philippines, is roughly 230 nautical miles. The Taiwan Strait itself is 110 miles at its widest point, and runs through waters that the U.S. 7th Fleet and the Taiwan Strait Combined Defense Concept have spent 4 decades learning how to complicate. For most of the past 30 years, the PLAN's answer to this geographic problem was a straightforward one: build enough anti-ship missiles, enough shore-based aviation, enough diesel submarines, and enough surface combatants that any U.S. attempt to contest those straits becomes prohibitively costly. This is the anti-access, area denial architecture. It is real. Its ranges are real. A DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile has a demonstrated range of roughly 1,500 kilometers. A YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship cruise missile carries a 500-kilogram warhead at Mach 2 to a range of 400 kilometers. These are not theoretical systems. They have been paraded down Chang'an Avenue. Their seeker heads have been tested. Their production lines are running. The U.S. Navy's institutional answer to A2AD has evolved considerably since the early 2000s, when the threat was first being formally gamed. The current answer is a combination of stand-in forces, Aegis-equipped surface combatants with SM-6 and SM-3 interceptors, Virginia-class attack submarines operating inside the first island chain, and a distributed maritime operations concept that tries to deny the PLAN a clean targeting picture by dispersing U.S. forces across a wide enough area that no single saturation strike can achieve mission kill against the whole network. What the Navy had not answered until recently was a specific subset of the problem: the drone swarm. Not the big expensive anti-ship missile that a Burke's S-6 radar can track and an SM-6 can intercept. The cheap one, the commercially derived one. A planned surface action group or a shore-based launch battery combining $300 one-way attack drones with a smaller number of high-speed anti-ship cruise missiles creates a layered problem that runs straight into the cost per intercept math of kinetic missile defense. An SM-6 costs roughly $4.7 million per round. A one-way attack drone built on commercial quadrotor architecture costs 4 figures. If you fire 200 drones at a task group and the task group expends 200 SM-6s to defeat them, you have just made the task group's magazine problem considerably worse before the real strike arrives. Beijing's wargaming teams have been working this math since at least 2019. The saturation problem is the single most discussed tactical challenge in unclassified naval literature on the Pacific theater. This is where the HELIOS program enters the picture and where the challenge becomes clear. The high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system was designed to address exactly this cost asymmetry. A laser once built and installed fires at roughly $1 per shot in electrical cost. It can engage a drone-sized target at ranges up to several kilometers. It does not run out of magazine. The obstacle is that directed energy systems at sea operate inside a complex atmospheric envelope. Salt haze, humidity, thermal gradients over warm water, all of these degrade the coherent beam before it reaches the target. The Navy's early HELIOS installations, including the system fielded on USS Portland in 2021, were rated against small unmanned aerial vehicles and small boat threats. Scaling that system to defeat a coordinated, multi-vector swarm attack in contested East China Sea conditions, where weather and jamming and coordinated saturation are all live variables simultaneously, is a different engineering problem than shooting a drone in a test range off San Diego. The Navy's solution was not to pretend the scaling problem did not exist. The solution was to make the existence of the program itself the signal, regardless of what the tested capability threshold actually was. And that decision, made somewhere in the interagency space between the Office of Naval Research and 7th Fleet's operational planning staff, is the reason DDG-1001 was in the East China Sea in September 2026 rather than USS Zumwalt or USS Lyndon B. Johnson. Digging through the public record on the Zumwalt-class program, one detail keeps coming back. The Navy's own cost-benefit language for the class shifted significantly between 2018 and 2024. Early advocacy framed the Zumwalts as land attack platforms, built around the advanced gun system and a naval fire support mission that the service kept describing as transformational right up to the point they canceled the long-range land attack projectile for cost reasons. By 2022, the internal language had shifted toward a different framing entirely. The Zumwalt hulls as directed energy host platforms. Their large electrical power plant and low radar cross-section recast is exactly the characteristics a high-energy laser installation requires. The Zumwalt class generates 78 megawatts of electrical power. An Arleigh Burke Flight 3 generates roughly 7.5 megawatts. The energy budget required to fire a meaningful directed energy weapon against a maneuvering target at useful range puts the Burke's power plant out of the running for the foreseeable future without a significant redesign. The Zumwalt's integrated power system, built around a turbine electric drive concept that the Navy spent years defending against critics who called it over-engineered, turns out to be the precise capability the directed energy mission requires. The expensive, criticized design choice is now the reason these hulls are the only ones that can host the next-generation weapon. The asset that looked like a procurement failure is the platform the strategy needs. That is the reframe, and it is why the Pentagon sent Monsoor instead of a Burke. The geometry of the Senkaku box made the signal harder to misread than any press release. Monsoor was not transiting the Miyako Strait, which would read as a routine 7th Fleet freedom of navigation movement. She was not conducting exercises with the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, which would read as an alliance management event. She was loitering in the East China Sea at a fixed position roughly 180 miles east of Tsurushima, the largest of the Senkaku Islands. She was, geometrically, sitting inside the outer edge of the area the PLN considers its operational approach to the Senkaku chain. And she was doing it for 7 days. The signal required sustained presence to be legible. A single-day transit proves nothing about persistence or operational endurance. 7 days of loitering proves the ship can hold a position, that her logistics tail back to Yokosuka is functioning, and that 7th Fleet is willing to accept the political friction of parking a Zumwalt-class destroyer with a laser mount inside a contested area for a week. What none of the open reporting addressed in the days after the deployment became public was the specific timing relative to Fujian. That is where the story changes. The Fujian, hull number CV-17, is the People's Liberation Army Navy's third aircraft carrier and its first to use electromagnetic catapult launch technology comparable to the systems fitted to USS Gerald R. Ford. She completed sea trials in 2024. Her air-wing integration and blue water certification had been tracked by open-source analysts through AIS data and satellite imagery. The timeline that emerged from that analysis, which circulated through defense think tanks and was cited in 2 separate Congressional Research Service reports, placed Fujian's first extended blue water certification exercise south of Okinawa in the 4th quarter of 2026. The December window was the most commonly cited estimate, 3 months from Monsoor's East China Sea loiter. The connection is not that Monsoor was there to threaten Fujian. She was not. The connection is what Fujian certification represents in the PLN's operational planning cycle. A certified blue water carrier group is a qualitatively different instrument than a carrier conducting near-shore training. It changes the targeting problem the 7th Fleet has to solve. It changes the number of assets the PLN can credibly threaten to move south of Okinawa in a contingency scenario. And it changes the internal confidence of PLAN planners about what coercive options look like in the Strait. The wargaming teams in Beijing who were running contingency analysis for the period following Fujian certification were also, necessarily, running cost exchange analysis on what it would take to suppress or defeat a 7th Fleet response. Those models include estimates of U.S. surface combatant capability. They include assumptions about magazine depths, radar coverage, and the cost per kill of American missile defense. And they did not, before September 2026, include a live demonstration that U.S. surface combatants in the East China Sea might be capable of engaging drone swarms at a cost per shot that renders the saturation model arithmetically insolvent. The complication in making this signal legible was atmospheric. The East China Sea in September is not a benign operating environment for directed energy systems. Late summer typhoon season leaves residual moisture and aerosol loading in the air column that degrades beam coherence. There was a Navy's operational parameters for the HELIOS derivative system on Monsoor, included atmospheric compensation software, but the range performance in high humidity conditions is measurably lower than in the dry, clear conditions off Southern California where most of the test data was generated. The signal the ship was broadcasting to Chinese sensors was not "we can destroy your drones from 15 kilometers in all weather." The signal was "this system exists on this hull, in this operational environment, and we are willing to demonstrate it publicly." The distinction matters. The Pentagon was not claiming omnipotence. It was changing the baseline assumption in Beijing's planning models from U.S. surface combatants have no cost-effective counter to saturation swarms to we cannot be certain they don't. In wargaming terms, that uncertainty is worth more than a proven capability. A proven capability can be modeled. An uncertain one forces conservative assumptions on every branch of the analysis. The strangest part of this deployment is not what Monsoor was doing, it is what the PLAN chose to do in response. The Y-9JB electronic intelligence aircraft that flew out from the mainland every single day for 7 days was not attempting to jam Monsoor's systems or to provoke an intercept. It was collecting. The PLAN's signals intelligence mission is to characterize the electromagnetic emissions of foreign systems, their radar frequencies, their fire control signatures, their communication protocols. A HELIOS derivative directed energy system operating in unclassified test mode produces distinctive electromagnetic signatures when it is ranging and tracking targets. The Y-9JB collected those signatures every day, and the Pentagon knew it was collecting them, because 7th Fleet's own electronic warfare assets were tracking the Y-9JB's collection tracks throughout the loiter. This is the architecture of the signal. The U.S. was not trying to hide what Monsoor was doing. The U.S. wanted the PLAN to collect as much data as possible on what the system's electromagnetic profile looks like, while deliberately withholding the performance data that would allow that profile to be accurately characterized. The Chinese analysts now have a week's worth of emissions data from a HELIOS derivative system. What they do not have is the system's actual performance envelope under contested conditions. They know what it sounds like. They do not know what it can do. That asymmetry of information is the weapon. What this deployment tells us about the current state of U.S.-China strategic signaling is that both sides have become sophisticated enough to treat military exercises and deployments as communication events directed at internal planning processes rather than external audiences. The message was not for the Chinese public, it was not for the Japanese government, which was briefed separately through alliance channels. It was for a specific set of analysts running specific models in a specific institutional context, 3 months before a specific calendar event. That level of precision in strategic communication is either a sign of mature deterrence architecture or a sign that both sides have gotten so good at signaling that they are beginning to outrun their own ability to correctly interpret each other's signals. We think the distinction matters more than most public commentary acknowledges. Here is the take that will get some pushback. The 7-day loiter was the right call, but the choice of the East China Sea rather than the South China Sea as the demonstration theater was a mistake in terms of signal legibility. The Senkaku context loads the deployment with Japanese domestic politics and sovereignty optics that partially obscure the purely military message. A comparable demonstration in the Philippine Sea or in international waters south of Okinawa directly on the Fujian certification track would have sent an identical capability signal with a cleaner strategic read. The Pentagon chose the East China Sea presumably because it fits within existing 7th Fleet operational patterns and creates less diplomatic friction with Beijing than operating on Fujian's specific projected route. The safer venue for the deployment slightly degraded the clarity of the communication. That is a real trade-off, and it is worth naming. The question that remains genuinely open: would you design the signal differently? If you are running 7th Fleet's planning staff in the summer of 2026 and you need Beijing's wargaming teams to update their cost models before the Fujian certification window, where do you park Monsoor and for how long? Drop your read in the comments. This channel reads every one. The second-order consequences of the deployment are already working their way through the plan's institutional response. Open-source analysis of Chinese military publication patterns after September 2026 shows a measurable increase in technical papers on drone swarm hardening. Specifically, papers addressing electronic countermeasures against directed energy acquisition radars, and papers on autonomous swarm behavior that does not require centralized electromagnetic coordination that a laser system could track and engage sequentially. The plan's technical community noticed the signal and began working the countermeasures. That is the expected institutional response. It is also, from Washington's perspective, the desired one. Every engineering hour the plan spends hardening its saturation doctrine against a directed energy counter is an engineering hour not spent on other capability development. The strategic cost of uncertainty is paid in adversary resources. The Miyako Strait remains the geographic anchor of this entire sequence. Its 170 nautical miles of width is the minimum viable corridor for PLAN surface forces moving from the East China Sea into the Philippine Sea. Any credible operational planning for PLAN blue water operations must route significant naval tonnage through that gap. USS Michael Monsoor, loitering 180 miles east of the Senkakus, was sitting at the northern edge of the Miyako transit geometry. Not blocking it, not threatening to block it, present in the vicinity of it, with a weapon system that complicates the transit calculus for any surface group trying to move through it while conducting drone-supported operations. The geography does the argument. The ship just had to be there. One element of the deployment that created real operational friction was the logistics tail. Monsoor's forward deployment through Yokosuka placed her 740 nautical miles from her support base when she was at maximum loiter distance east of the Senkakus. The Zumwalt class's propulsion reliability record in the early years of service was not uniformly positive. The class experienced a series of engineering casualties during its initial operational period, including a 2016 propulsion failure in the Panama Canal that required emergency tug assistance. By 2026, significant engineering work had addressed the most persistent propulsion issues, but operating a Zumwalt hull at extended range from its support node for 7 consecutive days without a logistics ship in company required a specific operational risk acceptance decision at 7th Fleet command level. That decision was made. It was the right call. But it was not a costless one. In terms of operational planning bandwidth and the risk calculus that 7th Fleet's commander had to formally accept. The deployment worked. The engineering held. But the gap between worked this time and fully reliable platform for sustained forward operations is a variable that the Zumwalt program's critics will continue to press, and that 7th Fleet's planners have to honestly account for when designing future operations on the same template. On the surface, committing a high-profile, politically visible asset like a Zumwalt-class destroyer with a novel directed energy system to a 7-day loiter inside a contested maritime zone looks like an aggressive choice. The counterintuitive read is that it is actually the conservative one. The alternative, allowing Beijing's wargaming teams to finalize their Fujian-era cost models without any data point about U.S. directed energy capability in the theater, leaves the plan's planners with a cleaner calculation. Saturation works. Magazine exhaustion is the path to mission success. Build more of the cheap weapon. Monsoor's presence introduced a variable that those models cannot cleanly resolve. In strategic terms, a messy adversary calculation is the objective, not a clean win. The deployment was not aggressive. It was clarifying, and clarification, in this theater, is what preserves the ambiguity that makes war less likely. The Fujian certification exercise is still 3 months away as of Monsoor's departure from the loiter station. Whether Beijing accelerates or decelerates that timeline in response to the September signal is the next data point. Comment, yes if you think the PAN moves the certification forward to close the window, or no if you think they slow it down to gather more capability data first. The answer will tell you something real about how Beijing reads the signal architecture. There is one piece of this that the publicly available reporting has not yet resolved, and it sits inside the question of what the HELIOS derivative system on Monsoor can actually do against a coordinated multi-axis swarm attack under realistic East China Sea operating conditions. The emissions data the Y9JB collected tells Beijing the system exists and produces trackable electromagnetic signatures. It does not tell them the kill chain timing. How fast can the system re-engage between targets? What is the minimum dwell time required for a lethal shot against a maneuvering, hardened drone at 5 kilometers versus 2 kilometers? These performance parameters are classified. The Palayan's analysts know they do not have them, and without them, any saturation model that assumes the directed energy system can be overwhelmed by a fast enough sequence of targets is a model built on an assumption, not a measurement. The Pentagon left that question open on purpose. It is the most important thing Monsoor did not show the Y9JB. The absence of data is the deterrent, not the data itself. The board reads differently now than it did in August. The Fujian certification exercise will proceed on some timeline. The Palayan surface fleet will eventually operate south of Okinawa with a carrier. That is a geometric fact that no 7-day Zumwalt deployment changes. What changes is the planning assumption set inside which that operation gets designed. If the Palayan's wargaming teams now have to model a 7th Fleet task group that includes a surface combatant capable of engaging saturation drone attacks at favorable cost ratios, the minimum required strike volume to achieve mission kill against that task group goes up. When the required strike volume goes up, the operational planning becomes more complex. When the operational planning becomes more complex, the confidence threshold for authorizing a coercive operation goes up. When the confidence threshold goes up, the probability of miscalculation triggering an unintended conflict goes down. This is how deterrence operates in the 21st century Pacific, not through the threat of massive retaliation, but through the accumulation of geometric and technical complications that make the adversary's preferred operational concept progressively harder to execute at acceptable cost. USS Michael Monsoor departed her loiter station on the 7th day and transited back through the Miyako Strait toward Yokosuka. The A-9JB stopped flying out to look at her. The East China Sea returned to its normal pattern of 7th Fleet transits and Palayan surveillance flights. The Senkaku box is still contested. The Miyako Strait is still 170 miles wide. The Fujian certification timeline is still uncertain. And somewhere in Beijing, a planning team is running revised models that now include a variable they cannot fully characterize. The geometry did not change. The calculus did. If this analysis gave you a clearer read on how the Pacific board is actually being played, the like button is right there. It is the single most effective way to push this kind of analysis past the headline and into the feeds of people who want it. The next move on this board is the Fujian certification exercise itself. When it happens, the shape of the U.S. response will tell you whether September's signal was read correctly or whether the communication failed. Subscribe and you will not miss the analysis when it arrives. One variable remains genuinely unresolved. The Lyndon B. Johnson, DDG Palin Solotul, the third Zumwalt hull, completed its integration workups in 2025 and has not yet been forward deployed to 7th Fleet. If the Monsoor loiter established a template, DDG-1 Solotu's first Pacific deployment will be the confirmation. If it deploys to a position south of Okinawa on the Fujian certification track rather than the Senkaku box, the signal architecture will be clearer and the audience will be unambiguous. That deployment has not happened yet. The planning decision has not been made publicly. One committed ally in the region is watching that decision closely and has made its interest known through private channels. Which ally and what it has asked for is the part of this story that has not yet surfaced in open reporting. The deterrent geometry holds today. The Fujian will eventually sail blue water, and the question that Monsoor planted in Beijing's planning process in September 2026 will still be open when she does. A laser turret on a Zumwalt hull rotating in the East China Sea in daylight does not answer the question of who controls the Western Pacific. It asks the adversary to answer a different question first. What does it cost to find out? Power is not what you can shoot. It is the question the adversary cannot stop asking before they decide to move.